Hello, magandang umaga sa ating lahat. Good morning, everyone. And we have 889 participants and more coming in. So shout out to the participants from University of Baguio, Baliwag Polytechnic College, Faith Colleges, Tanawan, Batangas. Good morning to all. Malig Plains Colleges Incorporated, San Juan de Dios Educational Foundation Incorporation, College, Pasay City, NCR, Palawan State Universities. So good morning to everyone and welcome to the LINANGAN, the GE Faculty Development Extension Program hosted by the UP General Education Center. Okay, so LINANGAN is the General Education Faculty Development Extension Program 2021-2022 is a webinar series for GE faculty of state universities and colleges, local universities and colleges, UP constituent universities, private and special higher education institutions, and other educational institutions. It aims to further enhance the teaching and learning of general education by creating spaces for teachers' conversations which will facilitate exchanges about content, teaching methods, classroom management, and learning resources under remote and blended flexible learning mode. The series will help faculty respond to the changing conditions brought by the health, environment, and economic crisis. It will be course-based to cater to the common interests and experience of the attendees. So I am Associate Professor Mary Grace Concepcion, and I will serve as your moderator for today's session on Teach Talk, how to teach and manage your Gen Z class. So this is the Purposive Communication edition. So before we begin, okay, let me just share a few reminders. So for our reminders, please type your questions or comments in the Q&A section in Zoom or in the Facebook or YouTube comment section. Please answer the evaluation form to receive your certificate of participation. And the evaluation form link will be posted in the Zoom chat box and YouTube before the webinar ends. Okay, the evaluation form will be closed on 28 March 2022 Monday at 11:59 p.m. We ask for your patience as we send the certificates by batches until 28 March 2022. If you cannot locate your certificate even after March 28, please check your spam folder before emailing us. So these are the reminders that we shall observe for our webinar series. So for our next round, okay, I will be reading the opening message of our Vice Chancellor, Maria Teresa Payongayong, and she sends her regrets because she cannot attend this webinar because she has to attend another meeting. But she has sent us her message for this webinar. So I will now read her message. So from VC Maria Teresa Payongayong, the General Education faculty from the constituent universities of UP, our colleagues from the various state universities and colleges, or SUCs, from the local universities and colleges, or LUC, private and special higher education institutions, or HEIs, and our partners from CHED regional offices, a pleasant morning to all of you. Under its Charter of 2008, or RA 9500, UP is mandated to perform its unique and distinctive leadership in higher education and development. This mandate includes, and I quote, leading in setting academic standards and initiating innovations in teaching, research, and faculty development in philosophy, the arts and humanities, the social sciences, engineering, natural sciences, mathematics, and technology, and maintaining centers of excellence in these disciplines and professions. UP is further mandated to serve as a graduate university by providing advanced studies and specializations for scholars, scientists, writers, artists, and professionals, especially those who serve on the faculty of state and private colleges and universities. It also serves as a research university in various fields of expertise and specialization by uh, um, conducting basic and applied research, promoting research and development, and contributing to the dissemination and application of knowledge. UP serves as a leader in public service and extension work by providing various forms of community, public, and volunteer service, as well as scholarly and technical assistance to the government, the private sector, and civil society, while maintaining its standards of excellence. End of quote. In fulfilling UP's mandate, it is important that UP shares its resources and skills with its colleagues from SUCs, LUCs, HEIs, and other offices and institutions. Our webinar for today, the sixth of a series, is another innovative way of sharing each other's knowledge on general education courses with the aim of providing our students with a broad perspective that hopefully would enable them to engage with local and global issues. Batid po natin na ang lahat naman po ng ating ginagawa bilang mga guro ay para sa ikabubuti ng ating mga mag-aaral. Allow me to thank our resource persons, partners, organizers, and participants for spending time today for this Teach Talk, How to Teach and Manage Your Gen Z Class Purposive Communication Edition. Sana po ay marami tayong matutunan sa isa't isa sa araw na ito. So this message is from Vice Chancellor Maria Teresa Payongayong of UP Diliman. Okay. So now, okay, again, let me greet, okay, our participants. Now we have 1,000 participants from Colegio ng Subic, from University of Visayas, Cebu City, Palawan State University, University of Bayumbong, Nueva Vizcaya. So thank you very much for your support and your participation in today's webinar. Okay, so now we move on and to introduce our first of our two speakers. In today's webinar on Purposive Communications, we have speakers from the Department of English and Comparative Literature. So our first speaker, okay, is Assistant Professor Marikit Tara A. Uychoco. Marikit Tara Alto Uychoco is an assistant professor at the Department of English and Comparative Literature in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She has written 3 textbooks for Rex Bookstore and has taught in several universities prior to teaching in UP. She has an undergraduate degree in BA English Studies and an MA in Education, major in Language Education English, both from UP Diliman. She is currently a PhD student in comparative literature at the same university. She has also worked for both public and private enterprises as a trainer, education consultant, and examiner, such as the British Council, Ateneo Center for English Language Teaching, and sa Aklat, Sisikat. So let us now welcome, okay, Marikit Tara Uychoco.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. And I'll be sharing. Could I share, please, host the screen so that I can share my my PowerPoint? Host, sorry.
Yes, ma'am, you can share.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So how do I share it now? Sorry. May I share? Or can you? Okay, there we go. Okay, it's there now. Okay, thank you. So today we're talking about purposive communication. And one of the things that was a problem for me when I changed from face-to-face classes to online classes was how do we get people's attention when it comes to online learning? So what I learned was about gamification, and that's why the strategy that I'm going to be talking about today is entitled Play the Game, Power Dynamics, World Englishes, and Gamification. Okay. What I'm going to talk about today is based on my textbook along with Dr. Maria Loreno Santos on purposive communication. It's entitled Communication for Society, Purposive Communication, which we wrote for Rex Bookstore. And we use parts of it for when we teach one of our general education courses, which is called English 30 in UP Diliman. Some of you might use English 30 and some of you might use purposive communication. What is the difference? So purposive communication takes up academic research, communication models, public speaking, essay writing, and corporate communication, while English 30 takes up English for the professions. And the coverage of purposive communication is a lot in UP Diliman. This is actually distributed in 3 different courses, namely Com3, English 13, and English 30. But for English 30, what I'm going to discuss right now, when we take up English for the professions, we take up communication and globalization and corporate communication and Philippine society. Okay, so the pandemic and online class, this is, I think, when we moved from face-to-face to online classes, we all had problems. And one of the problems was, how do you get people to pay attention? Because now that you're using a laptop, everybody has apps open. They can be chatting with someone on Facebook instead of actually paying attention to the screen. Like today, I'm sure some of you have several tabs open right now. You're on Facebook, you're on Instagram, and stuff like that. And that's perfectly fine. That has become a reality. So we're competing against multiple media. And how are we relevant, right? We're in a pandemic. Okay, so a lot of our students feel like, actually, I felt like it was sort of like the end of the world. There's a mental health crisis that's happening. And in the middle of a typhoon, sometimes you would have the electricity going in and out and in and out. So the question was, how do we make education relevant? How do we make our students feel like they have to pay attention instead of not paying attention? So I had to reflect a lot. And one of the things that I had to reflect on is, why am I not reaching my students? Especially if I have lectures, for example, which are, I think, really good, but are not quite affecting my students. The question is how? And I wasn't able to answer that until I researched or I reflected on my own language practice, because I had to pass as a PhD student. I had to pass a language test for Spanish. And even though I had textbooks for Spanish, and I went to classes for my Spanish class, one of the things that really helped me was called Duolingo. So Duolingo is this game, okay, where you can learn languages. And I got addicted to Duolingo. And one of the things that I asked the department after, and it actually helped me pass my Spanish language exam. Okay, so aside from being addicted and spending hours on Duolingo every day, and that's basically like studying a new language every day, it also helped me pass my Spanish language exam. So if you guys want to learn a new language, Duolingo is a really good model. I learned also that for online classes, my husband is actually a teacher in the College of Law. So you would think that in the College of Law, all of their techniques are rather boring, but no. They actually use Jeopardy labs, okay? So you have the college, the University of the Philippines College of Law, using games in order to teach law, okay? So if they can do that in the UP College of Law, of course you can do that in the college classroom as well. Okay, so, and I also remembered that when people would have socialization, because you couldn't meet your friends anymore, right? You couldn't see each other anymore. You couldn't have coffee anymore. Instead, people would meet via Zoom like here, and then they would have socials between friends. I know that there's already somebody raising their hand, but we'll have the Q&A later after I'm done with my lecture. Okay. Okay, so gamification. Okay, let me lessen this a bit if that's okay. Gamification in my teaching practice, Duolingo was addictive because you could see your scores on the leaderboard. And after my PowerPoint, I'll show you how the Duolingo looks like. I was also inspired by the houses in Harry Potter, where the members of each house could help them get higher points, whether it was in class participation, Quidditch, or a successful spell. So what happened was that I now divided my class, and I'm already on the second semester right now, where my class is divided into 4 houses. And in these 4 houses, the students have group grades, okay, and or what I call their house points, okay. And in their group grades, they can actually have higher or lower points based on these 3, the class participation, class participation, and whether they actually participate well in the games, okay? So we played Jeopardy games and other games, and class participation was by house. Participation in my classes skyrocketed afterwards, and when it came to the set, or what you call this, when the student evaluation of the teacher, many of my students gave me much higher scores after I did this in my language practice. Okay, so gamification in language learning and teaching apparently is actually being used. I know we've been using games in the classroom for a long time, but the term gamification is a little bit new, okay? The concept of gamification is basically new, and according to Werbach and Hunter, it is the use of game elements and game design techniques in non-game contexts. It's based on the success in the gaming industry, social media, and decades of research in human psychology. Gamification, or game-based learning or play-based learning, refers to a type of gameplay with clear and defined learning outcomes. It means employing well-designed digital and non-digital games to simulate learners' language, critical thinking, and problem-solving abilities. It includes elements of games or play into the learning environment to boost engagement and participation. Okay, so the lesson that I will take up, or I will discuss for today, which we also take up in English 30, is World Englishes and Power Dynamics in Purposive Communication. So when you do your games, okay, you don't just have a game because you want to have a game. It should be outcome oriented. Okay, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. So here, when using gamification in online learning, according to the research, students' grades improved 9%, and the number of students who failed the course decreased by 16%. Okay, that's a huge deal. Gamifying the language classroom enhances the learning of writing, reading, and speaking, and motivates collaboration and interaction. Gamification empowers and engages the learner with motivational skills towards a learning approach and sustaining a relaxed atmosphere. And the main objective of gamification is to increase participation and motivate users through the use of game elements such as points, leaderboards, and immediate feedback. So I really do use points, leaderboards, and immediate feedback. Okay, so the lesson that I'm going to be talking about today is World Englishes and Power Dynamics in Purposive Communication. So you will have, we discuss communication and globalization, and our lesson objectives is for the students to understand the implications of globalization on communication, to explain the notion of World Englishes in the context of English being a global language, and use standard English and bias-free language in writing. Okay, the image beside me is here, Braj Kashru's World Englishes dynamic. He was able to discuss, okay, the inner circle of English, which is from the United States and the United Kingdom, the outer circle of English, which is basically from people who are, what we call this, were colonized by USA and UK, and among them would be India and Philippines, and these people usually have English as an official language. And then the expanding circle of English, meaning the people who are learning English right now. But a lot of people are no longer happy with Braj Kashru's circles. So, oops. Why doesn't it want to go? Wait. Next slide. There. Okay. So, World Englishes from the Cambridge Encyclopedia has this as their circles. World Standard English as the center, meaning the English that is understood by everyone else. And then look what happened. American Standard English and British and Irish Standard English is just one, or they are just two of the different kinds of Englishes around the world that can create World Standard English. And if you look, I don't know why there's South Asian Standardizing English. I actually don't know why we're East Asian Standardizing English here in Philippine English, okay? But it goes to show that there should be a more egalitarian understanding of World Standard English. And if you think about it, when you speak, and I spoke in a recent international conference in Malaysia, it's really about the English that is understood by everyone. I mean, you don't have people pretending to have British accents in order to seem smarter than others. Okay, next, sorry. Okay, so there are many world Englishes, sometimes referred to as varieties of English, and all are equal in the sense that each is best suited to the communication needs of its speakers. However, not all are equal in prestige. Some varieties are more prestigious than others. It's important to know how certain varieties of English are stigmatized because of race. In post-colonial context, it's important to know the political forces and not just the economic forces that guide us in the use of language. Okay, so this is an example of a game. I know I'm a little, I only have 1 minute left, so I'm not going to be able to play the game with you guys, but I'll show you how the game looks like. And it's a game where students are supposed to know the different varieties of English. It helps them process and reflect when they should use certain words and for what audience. It helps them to think of the equalities and inequalities of English, and students identify what kind of English is being used. So, whose English is it anyway is a game where you show the word and the picture, and then it's a Zoom game. So students are supposed to type in immediately what kind of English it is. Is it Philippine English? Is it Australian English? Is it British English, etc.? So I have 10 examples, and I know I only have like a minute left, so I'll just show you the examples. But you have an idea that students will type it in, and then you'll give in the points, and then whoever has a bet, you'll put the points in the leaderboard eventually. So the first one is lift. Okay, so there you give them 5 to 10 seconds to guess, and then of course this is British English. Okay, rubber shoes. This is a nice example. What kind of English is rubber shoes? And they will be shocked to find out that it is Philippine English. Okay, rubber shoes is a term used for Philippine English. The term that's used in American English is sneakers. Okay, Barbie. Who uses Barbie for this? Okay, and the answer to this is actually Australian English. Okay, so you'll have students guessing what kind of English it is. This is Australian English. Biscuit. So if you look at that, if you think about it in American English, because that's the kind of English that we were educated, people will say that's a cookie, not a biscuit. But for British English, these are biscuits. Okay, overpass, and hopefully all of them know this is Philippine English. Okay, it's not American English, it's Philippine English. And then hawker center. I really like this example because I've been there and it sounds English, but it is English, it's Singaporean English. Okay, so it comes from Singapore English. Chill bumps. What does chill bumps instead of goosebumps? Chill bumps is actually that, as you can see in the picture, it comes from American English. Shocking, right? We thought that American English is what we all know, but this is actually a phrase that we don't know that comes from American English. Buggy. This is American English. So now, and amber is actually Australian English for beer, okay, for different kinds of beer. So now, and ball pen, I'm sorry, is Philippine English, okay? It's not used in other places. It's only used in the Philippines. Now we know, okay, I asked these questions to the students, okay? Which English is better? Which English should you use? What is standard English? What kind of English should you use in the classroom? What kind of English should you use in the radio or television? Now we know that the world English or the world standard English is the kind of English that should be understood by others, and therefore you should try to neutralize the cultural terms. And that's true for Philippine English, and that's true for American English, that's true for British English. You have to try to meet people in a particular common way, and that's how you do it when it comes to standard English. And which English is better? Eventually, I have students who go to the conclusion that all Englishes are equal. And that's so important because you don't feel inferior to British English or American English. Which English should you use? That depends, okay? You have to figure it out. So that's why I asked, what kind of English should you use in the classroom? What kind of English should you use in the radio or television? And the truth is, you might think that right now what I'm speaking is American English, but what I'm speaking is Philippine English. Everybody understands that what I'm speaking is Philippine English because I was educated here. I grew up here. And this is the language that I use. So use standardized Philippine English in the classroom. What kind of English should you use in radio or television? Use standardized Philippine English in radio or television. If you're in a BPO and you're pretending to be American, use standardized American English. Okay, so there are other things that we also discuss in that particular book, how you're supposed to be culturally sensitive when it comes to race and ethnicity, gender and sexual orientation, social class, age, and disabilities. But basically that's it, because I think that's all the time I have. I went a little bit over time, and thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Grace, and Grace, you can, it's up to you whether we will start taking up the questions or if I think we should go to the, or go to the next one. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, Professor Huichoco, for your presentation. So the questions and answers, okay, could be reserved later on for our open forum. So just prepare your questions for Professor Huichoco for later. So now we move to our next speaker, who is Assistant Prof. Irish Joy de Ocampo. So Irish Joy de Ocampo is a faculty at the Department of English and Comparative Literature in UP Diliman. She has a bachelor degree in English Studies, major in language from the same university. She recently earned a master's degree in Cultural Anthropology and Development Studies from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. Her research interests include multimodality, critical pedagogy, and gender and development studies. So a round of virtual applause for our next speaker, Assistant Professor Irish Joy de Ocampo. Good morning.
Good day to everyone, to my fellow educators. Thank you for coming to this webinar. I am Irish Joy de Ocampo, an assistant professor from the Department of English and Comparative Literature, UP Diliman. I am presenting a talk on Teach Talk, How to Teach and Manage Your Gen Z Class. My talk is entitled Keeping It Profesh. So this is a discussion of my teaching experiences and practices in my English 30 course. So for today, I will be covering the following topics. First, I will present an overview of English 30, English for the Professions, or Purposive Communication, perhaps for some of you. I'm also going to present possible approaches and strategies in facilitating the class in face-to-face and remote setup. And then at the end of the presentation, I will show you a sample lesson that I carry out in my class. So first, let me provide a brief overview of the course English 30. So English 30 is called English for the Professions. It is one of the general education courses offered by the Department of English and Comparative Literature. So most of the time, this GE is taken or enrolled in by students of junior and senior standing in preparation for their graduation when they start looking for employment outside of the university. So the course covers the principles and uses of writing in English in the various disciplines and professions. It also frames English as both a variety and a register that must be located within particular contexts of use, highlighting the need to be sensitive to how language is used in different professions. So in a way, you can also think about English 30 as using English in specific contexts. However, the course has undergone a review and a revision in the past years in order to address the shift to K-12 of the current education system. So we recognize that this particular course is also taught or is included in the senior high curriculum. And so we had to revisit and review how to elevate and how to design the course in a way that will be appropriate to the shift in the curriculum and the readiness of the students. So English 30 now has a more critical framing. So it also is concerned with critiquing mere document production, emphasizing the need to go beyond forms and templates and open up possibilities for new ways of engaging in the workplace. So the main goal of English 30 is best described by these two sub-goals. So one is to provide a nuanced understanding of the principles of effective communication in English, and also a critical awareness of the conventions that shape and are shaped by the discourse in the various professions in the Philippines. So these are the four main modules or main topics that are covered in English 30. The first is discourses in English in the Filipino workplace. So this is where before talking about the conventions, before learning the rules, we talk about the role of English in the workplace, in the global and in the local setting. And then we talk about the communication strategies in the workplace, discussing what kinds of communications or correspondences are appropriate in certain contexts. And then we also talk about graduate employability. How do you prepare for job hunting? What do you do in your resume, etc.? All those things. And the last module is on group dynamics and problem-solving culture in the workplace. So the assumption here is that you are already part of a particular professional field, and then you have to work with different people and solve problems in the workplace. So those are the four main modules. So seeing all of these things come together, the course outcomes of English 30 are best explained in three concepts. First is knowledge. So an understanding of the principles of business communication. What are the conventions? What is the role of culture in communication and vice versa? Why do we have to talk English in certain contexts and we code switch in other contexts? So that has to do with knowledge and understanding those issues. But it is also important that this knowledge is translated into skills, so practical skills, wherein we can adopt the strategies that are discussed in class. So if knowledge is the what, skills now is the how. So how do we do that? How do we use English? How do we communicate? But more importantly, we also want to answer why, the why. Why are these conventions this way? Is this the only way to communicate? Is it possible to communicate differently or question how we communicate? Why do we use English and not Filipino, etc., etc.? So these three are the core course outcomes that English 30 aims to achieve at the end of the semester. So knowing that, I am now going to talk about what I have been doing in my class that I found useful and effective, specifically to a Gen Z audience. So since I am part of the millennial generation, there is some similarities in the way we approach learning, but there are important nuances as well that are different. So I will be presenting to you my strategies, or maybe some practices that I do in my class, in two parts. So first is what I did in my class before the pandemic happened. And then the second part is what I have done last semester when I was teaching during the pandemic. So I want to also frame my explanation or my discussion in terms of facilitation rather than teaching. So I acknowledge that I am not really the sole expert or the sole source of knowledge and experience when it comes to discussing professional communication. First, because I know that I'm in a particular professional field, which is the academe, and that the conventions of communication in the academic community is different than the conventions that are used in the field of corporate, for example, or in specific government offices. So I explain that limitation to my students. But secondly, it's also important for me to frame it in this way because I want the students to know that they themselves are sources of knowledge and expertise, especially because they are from the particular field that they communicate. They already have experiences as well. So their knowledge and expertise are equally valid, if not as valid as mine. So I frame the course as that I am a facilitator more than the teacher or a lecturer. Okay, so given that framing, so I start with this. So I think in my class, I try to apply a critical framework when I talk about communication principles or before talking about communication principles. So as I already mentioned earlier, English 30 has a more critical component perhaps than what was taught in the senior high curriculum. So I also assign critical texts to the class. So this salient points are discussed in the class as well. So I do this before I teach or before we discuss the conventions of writing or the conventions of communicating. So some of these texts have to do with problematizing English as, the universal language or the business language or the language of choice in the professional field. Some of the texts also have to do with gender and power and politeness and why do we speak English in a particular register when we are talking to a group of people versus when we are talking with our peers. So these are the things. So I start with the why so that when we go to the discussion on the house, like what is the correct way to write a formal report, the students already know why we are doing it. I think it also engages them more and they start to appreciate the class, not just as a monotonous class of being prescribed what to do, but rather understanding how these conventions came to be. And even, ultimately questioning and maybe changing these kinds of conventions in the future. So the second part of my, what the second strategy that I use is real-time application. So English 30 is a practical course because again, the aim is to prepare the students to communicate in real life, in a real life situation. So in my course or in my class, I organize several role-playing activities to simulate workplace scenarios. So the students are given scenarios that include possible communication challenges among their future colleagues, for example, or even amongst themselves. So sometimes we do acting in class. I give them slips of paper where there is a communication challenge and they have to act it out and to demonstrate how they will resolve it. But not all of these activities are done offline or in class. Some of them can also be done in online mode. So for example, I give them an email prompt and I wait for them to submit or send an email to me to address the activity or the prompt that I gave them, and then I present it to the class, and then we talk about whether the response was appropriate or not, which leads me to my third teaching strategy or practice, which is immediate feedback. So it's important that in these activities, there is an immediate feedback or there is an established feedback mechanism. At the same time, I want to highlight how immediate feedback does not only come from the teacher or me, but also from among their peers or the students themselves. So we are given equal opportunity to give and receive immediate feedback on their oral and written output. So for example, the one that I mentioned earlier, if there is a role-playing activity, right after they present their performance, we ask the classmates to give feedback, to give a constructive criticism and suggestions, and also appreciation for what they have done. So I think that immediate feedback is able to achieve two goals. So first is that they are also able to practice their communication skills. Like, how do you communicate feedback? How do you communicate a suggestion without, being offensive, but also asserting your suggestion or idea? But at the same time, this is also a simulation of what it's like to be in the workplace, where you are constantly given an assessment or an evaluation by your mentor or your boss, or you are given opportunities where you have to give feedback to your colleagues or to people that you are managing. So in this way, by providing immediate feedback, then the students are able to practice their communication skills both in the classroom and in preparation for when they are in their professional fields. This is also integrated in the peer grading. So for example, I'm not the only one who gives grades to my students. There's also peer grading. As much as it is quantitative, I also make sure that there is a chance for them to give a qualitative feedback, so they can write their comments to justify the grade that they give to their classmates. So that's one. So all of these activities, as you can notice, have to do with collaboration and group work. And also my involvement is more of a consultative nature. So they were designed indeed to promote collaboration because, again, it's also a way to prepare the students to the reality of a highly diverse and collaborative workplace, because some of their classes do not necessarily provide opportunities for collaboration. But I make it a point that although there are individual activities and there are individual assessments, make sure that in English 30, they, as much as possible, engage with each other. Again, because this is both to hone their skills in communicating with different kinds of people, but to also simulate the scenario where you are working with different kinds of people, and it's a reality that they have to face eventually. For me, I do my consultations with them whenever they need maybe either a mediation. So in cases where there is a problem that cannot be resolved by the group alone, then that's when they can consult with me. I also make myself available for individual consultations so that students who have particular questions or concerns can bring them up with me. Again, this is also to model the mentorship that happens in the workplace, and also maybe to give them a chance to practice asking for help or asking for feedback from their future bosses or their future colleagues. So all of these things that I try to incorporate in my lessons. However, 2020 happened, and we know that the face-to-face setup is no longer possible, and then we have to shift to remote learning. It was also during this time that I was on study leave and I had to do my master's. So I was both, I'm also a student of remote learning. So my experience in teaching English 30 during the pandemic is shaped by my experience as a student of that setup, but also from the tips that my colleagues also gave me, because I only recently returned to teaching, and I also had to figure out the ways to manage my class given the reality of a remote setup. So I had to scale back teaching English 30, taking into consideration the strategies that worked in face-to-face, and I had to figure out how to make sure that that still happens, or at least to fit those approaches in Zoom or in offline modes. So my first concern was to, of course, lessen the assigned readings and lectures. I I recognize, and I also know that in the remote setup with the pandemic, with the global health crisis, it is just a burden to have to read so many things and accomplish so many things for class, on top of, you know, the anxiety of health concerns for our family, the loss of jobs, etc., etc. So taking this into consideration, I had to rethink what texts are essential and remove some of the texts that I think I can do away with, and made them into supplementary readings rather than assigned text. So I still made those texts available, but it's the student's discretion if they want to read those suggested readings. I also made sure that the critical readings were assigned as independent work, so I don't have to call for a synchronous session all the time and have a lecture or discussion. So the discussion forum in the Google Classroom setup, for example, has been useful, because even if we don't have to go online and discuss the text, they can still discuss with each other. And I think it was actually more engaging for them, because then they have more time to think about their answers, and they can read each of their classmates' answers and respond to that. So what I often do is I have a prompt question, or two or three questions, and they can choose one question that they want to answer, and then I ask them to respond to at least two classmates in the discussion forum thread. I think for some colleagues they use Discord for this, but for me, so that it's more uniform and everything is in one platform, I use Google Classroom. And then when we have synchronous sessions for the activities, I try to integrate this into the class and try to reference the assigned readings that they had to accomplish during independent work or during the offline asynchronous sessions. So that's one, and I think many of my students appreciated that, the lessening of their assigned readings. So the second problem is, of course, the idea of collaboration and participation. So that was one of the most challenging aspect, I think, of teaching English 30 is because you don't have a physical space where students can actually get together and talk to each other and discuss, you know, these role-playing activities, for example. It's difficult to do them if there's no physical space. However, online platforms have provided for these kinds of concerns. So I use the breakout sessions in Zoom calls a lot, because for me, it helps continue to promote the collaboration aspect of the class. So for example, whenever I have this discussions, I put them in breakout sessions rather than waiting for students to answer in the plenary, because I've observed and I experienced it myself that it can be awkward to talk to a screen and have everyone look at you, versus when it's in the classroom, right, where you don't really see your classmates looking at you. So I figured that in a breakout session, there are there are three or four in that breakout session, and they don't feel they don't feel like they're on the spot. So I thought that was something great for them, especially for those who are uncomfortable with the attention. So what I often do is I spend 30 minutes for the breakout session. So I give them 2 to 3 questions that they can use as guide questions for their discussion. And then we go back to the big group to synthesize their answers. And I also do some quick activities there. So I give them a scenario and they discuss the scenario in the breakout session, and then they present per group in the plenary session. I thought that was useful. I also try to I always provide the chat box as an option for answering some of the questions that I ask in class, because I know that not everyone has a good Wi-Fi connection, so they can put their answers in the chat box. And sometimes I also make them respond in just the chat box, and nobody has to turn on the audio. So I thought those practices were quite useful and engaging for the students as well. It's also an opportunity for them to get to know each other, because one of the feedback that I got from my previous class is that they prefer group work actually now that there's remote learning, because they don't have a chance to really talk to their classmates or their friends. So they think that group activities give them some sort of a social life. Previously, in my experience, older students don't really like group work because they don't want to get to know new people. But I think the remote setup has made them a little bit more sociable online, at least. So yeah. And then again, because this is the Generation Z students, they're constantly bombarded with multimodal output. They have YouTube, they have TikTok, so they learn in more multimodal ways rather than monomodal. So I think that it's also strategic to take advantage of that. So for me, I try to take that into consideration when I hold my classes or facilitate activities. So they don't really like lengthy lectures and text-heavy presentations. I try to include audiovisual elements in my presentation as much as I can. So for example, I use Canva more often now than PowerPoint, because Canva already has established designs, and the designs are also modern, and it caters to a younger audience. So for example, this presentation is created using Canva. So I think that's also one way to make the lectures more engaging. At the same time, I also allow them to use multimodal functions in responding to me. So whenever I ask for questions, sometimes I ask them to use emojis. Like for example, how do you, if you can explain your response to this statement using an emoji, what is it? And then they will reply in the chat box just using an emoji. And then maybe if there are volunteers, I ask them to explain their answers. Sometimes I also ask for like songs, like if your current mental state is a song, like what is it and why? So I think these kinds of simple activities are able to engage their multimodal preferences. I also use other platforms such as Mentimeter to encourage participation. So Mentimeter is this, so I learned this also from a fellow professor. So you can ask questions and make them answer anonymously, because in Zoom or in Google Meet, even if they don't turn on their audio, they can give an answer and you know who said what. But in Mentimeter, you can have word clouds and you can have questions where the participants' names are not shown. So that also provides a safer space for them to be honest and really share their ideas without worrying about the judgment of their classmates or the judgment of their teachers, etc. So I think there are also other options like Kahoot, where you can turn your lecture or presentation into a quiz or a game. And I think those things make the discussion in class more engaging, and give them chance to feel that it's less formal, at least, and it engages their other senses as well. And lastly, outsource your learning materials. I have done this in the semester when it was still face-to-face. I used to invite people from the different fields to talk to my class. I have a a former classmate in college who has experience with HR. So he used to work in recruitment. So he has experience interviewing candidates and fresh graduates. And he's also from the same university. So I have asked him to speak to my class for 3 times, I think, already. And I think the sessions have always been productive. The students are able to ask questions, and they get like really useful tips and suggestions from my friend, because again, I don't really have enough expertise about that. So I try to incorporate, or at least outsource my lecturers in class. Last semester, I was hoping to, I was planning to create a panel with alumni. However, there was this COVID surge in January, so my friends who were supposed to talk in my class got sick, and most of my students also got sick, so it didn't happen. So, but I'm hoping to do that next semester, or this semester rather. But if you don't have that at your disposal, you can also use videos, podcasts, film clips as resources. So for example, because I cannot simulate, ask them to role play in real time because of the pandemic or because of the remote setup, I look for like film clips that portray workplace communication, some local, some international, and use that as a way to, as sources for analysis. And we analyze, why did the character say that, why did this character do this, etc., etc. So I think those are things that are quite useful as well, so you don't feel like you always have to constantly be the source of information. At the same time, this is also an opportunity for you to ask the students to look for their own resources and share this with the class. And again, that fosters collaboration among the peers. And even you as a teacher, you also learn from them. I also ask the students to submit a diagnostic essay at the beginning of the semester, where they're supposed to interview a professional in their field. And then in that interview, I ask them to inquire about the challenges that the professional faces in the workplace. And so I use the answers of their interviewees in my activity, so that I don't have to think of new scenarios, because again, for me, I have a different communication challenge in my field. So I also use what the students give me as my kind of source or learning material for them to respond to. And so at least it's also as akin to the reality of the workplace context. Okay, so that's the general those are the strategies, the general practices that I do in my online class in the last semester that I have found to be useful and engaging and effective to my students. And again, that is also as a response to some of their feedback, like the use of breakout sessions is a response to their feedback that they would prefer to talk to their classmates rather than, attend a synchronous session. So it's also important to ask for feedback from your students directly, so you know what kinds of concerns they have, and then you can think about how to address them. Okay, so as promised in the last part of my presentation, I said that I will be discussing a lesson. So this is one of the last lessons that I cover in English 30, which is graduate employability. So I have two main topics here, which is writing the resume and preparing for the job interview. So what I do is I have a asynchronous module that they need to accomplish and read. So they are introduced to the basic conventions of writing the resume, and then they also see sample resumes to prepare for their job interview. So this is independent work. And then when they are able to finish drafting their resume and their cover letter, they submit it to me, and they also give it to their classmates so that they can give feedback and suggestions. And they are given the time to revise this resume and the cover letter as well. And when they are done revising, so the application is, we simulate the entire job application process. So the students then, they send their resume to me via email as if I'm the HR officer. So I also ask them to decide what is the company's name. If this is a real company, then might as well practice now. So I respond as if I'm the HR officer, the recruitment officer. Sometimes I also pretend, so I also provide curveballs for the students. So for example, I'll give them a schedule that I know conflicts with their schedule. So that is also a test. That is also a way to test them on their skills. So how do you address a conflict of schedule when the person you're talking to is someone that you want to impress because you want to be hired for the job. So those things are also considered in the process. And then when a schedule is set, we have the mock interview via Zoom. So that's often just 20 to 25 minutes. Then immediately after their interview, I give them feedback on how they can improve and what they did well. And I also give them a chance to ask me questions for clarifications. One of my students last semester was a survivor of the typhoon, but he insisted on attending the mock interview, but the Wi-Fi signal in their province was not very stable. So I had to do the interview via landline or via phone call. So that was quite an interesting experience. It was my first time, but I realized that it is also a common practice in the workplace to have a phone interview. So I think that could also be an alternative option in case the student does not have a Wi-Fi signal in their place. So that's the general sense of how I teach this particular course. And I hope that you found some useful things in that explanation. Okay. So how do you keep it professional, but still appropriate and modern? So of course, we always have to maintain our pace as teachers who are also learners and collaborators. So again, it's important to highlight in English 30 in Purposive Communication that there should always be participation, application, collaboration, and engagement. So that is my talk. Thank you for listening. I hope that you found some of the things that I said, that I hope that you found this talk useful, and I am looking forward to your question.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Assistant Professor De Ocampo, okay, for your presentation on how to keep it pro-fresh, okay, for the English 30 classroom setup. So now we go on a 10-minute break. Okay, so we come back at 10:20 to resume our sessions and our Q&A. And yes, I think Assistant Professor Ochoco would want to say something. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually, when I looked at the time, I found out that I was going fast, and I actually readied 2 games that teachers could also check out. So if it's okay, before the break, I'll just show very quickly what these games look like to also add a little bit more to what what I was talking about, gamification, if that's okay.
Okay, you may proceed, Professor Richoco.
Okay, thank you. So, oops. Wait. So, oops, wait, I'll stop sharing first and I'll go and fix it. So this is an example of Jeopardy Labs if you've used it before. Here you go. So Jeopardy Labs, and I know that you guys also teach academic writing. So I have my students, they're divided into 4 groups: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Slytherin, and Ravenclaw. And then you ask the question, what is the kind of documentation needed for papers about social sciences and the sciences? And then if your internet connection is bad, okay, you can just ask them to answer using typing, but you can also, if you can actually do it live, you can hear them. So what I do is I ask them to shout out their group. So Gryffindor, and then they answer what is the APA style of documentation. So we have all of these things. So what is a short description of something taken from a text? Okay, what is a summary? Okay, so people have scores that they can, let's say, okay, the kind of documentation, what is the kind of documentation needed for papers for the humanities and the arts? Of course, you have MLA or modern language style of documentation. Let's say Gryffindor one. So I will give them 300. From 100, it becomes 300 points. So it's really nice because you're able to give points, and then you can also lessen points. Like the last one, what is citation of sources in the essay itself? And that is in-text citation. So let's go and give it to Slytherin. Let's say if it's a wrong, they didn't give in-text citation, they gave the wrong one, you can actually lessen the points. But what I do, my deal with my students is that I will always give them points. I will never lessen their points. But of course, it's really up to you. Another example, okay, let me stop sharing first before I show it. Okay. So you have Duolingo, and Duolingo is really interesting because this is my Duolingo, by the way, where you can show which level you are. So it gives you additional motivation if you're in a particular level, and then you are given points. So my points, or that's how many crowns I have, and then my points is actually 740 ingots already, so you can shop. And then you have different what you call this, so you start a lesson. From that lesson, you're able to, well, it usually works, it usually works better on your phone, where you have lessons and then you answer that as well. So you try to find out what the meaning of these words are and stuff like that. Okay, so there. Okay, so that's just examples of those words. Okay, you may use bamboozle. It works like Jeopardy Labs as well. Okay, thank you very much, AR. I'm sorry, I didn't see the name. Okay, so there, and then I guess we can go on a break. I just wanted to share a bit of what it looks like. There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Ochoco, for sharing your exercises with us. So now we go on a 10-minute break. We come back at 10:25. And while we're on break, we could get coffee, we could go on a health break, and we will play some exercises, okay, so that we could stimulate, healthy minds mean healthy body. Okay, so we come back 10:25. Okay, see you. And next we go on for our open forum after the break.
Simpleng ehersisyo sa palaupong pamumuhay o sedentary lifestyle. Sabi nga nila, sitting is the new smoking, at ang pag-upo ng matagal ay nakakasama sa kalusugan. Sundin ang mga sumusunod. Ehersisyo sa leeg at balikat. Ehersisyo sa kamay. Ehersisyo sa likod at legs. ugaliing gawin itong mga ehersisyo kada 1 oras ng pagkakaupo. Ehersisyo sa leeg at balikat. Ehersisyo sa kamay. Ehersisyo sa likod at legs. Isang paalala mula sa OSHC.
Okay, good morning to everyone. Okay, so now we resume our session, okay, and we proceed to our open forum. And before we proceed, we have 1,000 participants in the house, and then I would also like to greet the 100 and more participants in our on our FB page and around 230 participants in our YouTube channel. So we are having a full house today, and thank you very much for supporting the UPGEC webinar series. Okay, so now we go to our question and answer, our open forum part of our webinar. So our first question would be this one. How can a teacher start the discussion that allows students to enjoy and be encouraged to participate in class? So questions on how to encourage participation in the virtual class. Okay, anyone?
For me, basically, I just either ask a really interesting question. I mean, the traditional way of teaching works. You still have the motive question and motivation question. And it's just how to put that over towards online, and then of course it also helps if you have a game in the beginning. It does help because people are suddenly interested and invested, especially when they care about their scores, like they're competing and they care about whether they have higher points or lower points. And then after the game, when you have the discussion, people are much more participative and they care more about the answers to the questions. If you had just had a lecture, they might not be that interested. So for me, starting with a game or a motive question or a motivation always is helpful for me.
Okay. Professor De
Um,
Ocampo?
So I also echo Kit's suggestion. I think that's that's a framework of pedagogical practices to have like something to spike someone's attention. So I just would like to add perhaps that aside from maybe asking a question or playing a game, I also show videos. So instead of maybe asking them a question or having a direct activity, what I do is, at least in my English 30, I start with the video so that they can watch it, or sometimes I paste the link so they can watch it maybe on their phones. So I think that's one way to do it. And then for if you're doing an online thing, I mentioned earlier Mentimeter, and I think some of the teachers also had really good suggestions as well in the chat box earlier. So I think that's really good. With Mentimeter, it's nice because you ask a question and then they organize the answers in very visual ways. And I think that if it's in a traditional setup, you don't really see that. Like you just hear your classmates' answers or you just hear your teacher. But maybe using other platforms like Mentimeter or Kahoot, and then there's a visual layout of the answers in front of the screen. So I think that could also start the engagement.
Okay, so for our next question, what are the best strategies to use to develop the communication skills of the students in the online classroom?
Maybe I can say I'll start. So
okay.
That,
yeah.
I think it's such a general, it's quite a broad question, and it's a bit harder to answer it if there's no specific context. But I think with communication specifically as a skill, it always boils down to practice. I think at the end of the day, you can never really speak. I mean, you will never learn or you will never improve your skills if you don't practice. So I think like Kit's example of you playing the Duolingo, it's really that it forces you to practice. So for me, you can design as teachers, if we can design activities and lessons that can promote constant practice for our students, and and not only that they are forced to constantly practice, but also make sure that those activities are conducive and safe. I think its example is very specific to like gaming, so it's very more competitive. Mine is more maybe on the more collaborative side. So what I've learned is that most of these students, at least, and I've been seeing this as a pattern in some of my Gen Z students. They have so much anxiety in terms of
Yeah.
socializing with each other. So for me, what I'm trying to do now in my online spaces or with my learning, and perhaps if we go back to face, I can do it again, is to make sure that the activities also make them feel safe to talk to each other. So that's why I gave an example, like, small breakout sessions where it's just 2 or 3 people, and then at least they don't feel like they're on the spot. So I think making sure to know what your students value, like, do they value smaller, safer spaces, or do they value maybe more high engagement kind of activities are also important.
Yes.
For me, I
Okay.
still like having um a mix of activities. But one, for example, is it's good what Irish was saying, that things have to be safe. You have to feel safe when it comes to discussing not just with your class but with your teachers as well. And then when it comes to particular skills, when it comes to writing, very important is that writing is a process. Okay, so we cannot think that when you give in the paper, it's done and then it's graded, it's done. So no, you really have, I really believe that writing is a process. There's collaborative writing, and there should be some kind of relationship between the teacher and the students. So even before they give in the paper, there should be consultations. For example, what topic should they take up, what they should, when they give in the outline, there should be discussion with the teacher about whether that's a good outline. There should be a discussion with the teacher of what else they need to read, what else. So there is a very wonderful what do you call this, relationship that happens between the teacher and student. Now I learned this especially late, because when I was being mentored by my graduate faculty, that's what happened. It really helped me. So what I do is, maybe you can't do that with X number of students. So what I do is, again, they're divided into houses, okay? And you can have houses create these particular outlines, and then you can have a group consultation, so that when it comes to a group consultation, that immediately lessens the amount of work you have to do, because you have more time. When it comes to speaking engagements, I still believe that it's important for them to have, for example, in purposive communication, the interview. Okay, you can't believe how much anxiety that creates.
Yeah.
There's so much anxiety. They are used to speaking in a group, right?
Mhm.
But when it comes to speaking one-on-one with their teacher, that just like, that makes them so scared. And the fact that they're already so scared when it comes to speaking to a teacher is really good practice for when they speak to their employer. So
Okay.
you have to think of the real world. What I do is, when we have an interview, I do two things. I grade them, and then I give immediate feedback. I tell them immediately after the interview why they did badly and what they can do to become better. Because what I care about, really, I tell all of them, I don't care so much about the grades. What I care about is, when you're getting interviewed for your job, that you will not do as badly as you did in class. So when they have it, when they understand the real world implications, then they sort of suddenly try to level up. And that's the most valuable thing when it comes to purposive communication, that you have the interview, I think. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So there's a follow-up question. What are the factors to consider in communicating effectively in this generation, especially with the shift to online learning and all of the challenges, as you mentioned, the anxieties that our students are facing today?
I think Irish can answer that very well, based from what she already presented.
Ma'am Grace, can you repeat the question po?
Yeah, I'll repeat. What are the factors to consider in communicating effectively in this generation?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I feel that this generation, there is a shift in terms of how they think about power relations when they communicate, because traditionally, diba, when you look at even the resources that I use for my English 30 class, it's number one, it's made in the USA, so the context is already different. Second, it was made during a particular period in time when business communication is still very linear, it's still very vertical. So, for example, we are used to calling, especially in Filipino culture, diba? We say, ma'am, professor, sir, ganyan. But from what I've been learning from my students, and I think perhaps most of us can agree, they are so, they do not really think about communication in terms of verticality anymore. And I think one of the factors is technology. So last meeting, I actually asked my Gen Z, my students in English 30, if they, because we were talking about politeness and power as a, that was our topic. So we were discussing before we were supposed to discuss how to email and how to write a proper business letter, etc. But then I heard from a conference a few days ago that some teachers think that this generation is rude and they don't know how to send emails, for example. And it's my firsthand experience that I did get that sense, like, oh, the students sometimes they don't say dear ma'am blank, or if they email they have smiley faces or hoo ha ha ha. I don't know if you receive that kind of email. I think both of my colleagues here are smiling, and so I asked them about that. Like, do you feel that that is being informal being impolite? Like, when you are informal, do you feel like you are being impolite? And I was surprised by their answers, because they said that actually no. They said that that's why they try to speak in more informal ways, because they didn't want to be too formal and too distant from the person they're talking to. Because for them, if you're too formal, they feel like you're being rude, and you're being, di ba, pag face to face, like in Tagalog, parang ang straight mo masyadong magsalita, like good morning, if you say good morning with a period. So for them, they add all of these things like an emoji, or they add other things, not because they think they're being rude or they don't consider their teacher as an authority, but they want to convey, in fact, that they have an emotional relationship with the teacher and they're not treating them rudely. So I thought it was interesting, because I feel like I'm sandwiched between that generation who think in more traditional terms, and I still do, to be honest, but also trying to make sense of this new generation, making sense of, speaking in through digital platforms. I don't know if this really answered the question, but I think this is just a glimpse of how these students think, and perhaps if we teachers are aware that they have this kind of framing, then we can maybe talk about these things with them, and start from where they are, rather than just impose, like, no, you have to really be formal, you have to stop using emojis, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that's just an example, or like a very specific case of like trying to understand what kinds of students we have now, and again with plus the dimension of having to teach online. So I think maybe Kit wants to add something as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And then another thing is that I've done Google Classroom ever since 2020. And then I only started doing Zoom recently because I had a problem recording my sessions in Google Classroom. And I found out that I really like class participation better in Zoom, because you have, instead of raising your hand, you can actually put emojis, right? So when you have emojis, I mean, nowadays, especially in UP, you can't really require people to keep the video on. So you can't see people's faces when they respond. So I find it extremely helpful when I see my students responding using emojis, when they're just doing you putting hearts, when they're putting like the crying emoji and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I find that, diba? And you're giving a lecture and then you have a crying emoji, and I'm like, wow, they're really reacting. And also they feel like they're sort of in a level playing because they can control the screen, right? You can put whatever you want emoji on what's happening right now. So I think that's also really good for us to be able to give students some what do you call this, some power, empower them a little bit more. Then especially since this is usually if you use like a video or the internet, it's usually a one-way thing. So to make things more collaborative, more interpersonal, more to empower students more is very important. Can I also there's one of the things that I saw while I was looking at the chat was a question about what happens with language barriers, and I just wanted to address that because 2 weeks ago, I think I was in a conference with ASELT, and it was the Linguistic Society of the Philippines and ESEA, English in Southeast Asian. I forgot what ESEA means anyway. But one of the things that I talked about in one of my papers was about how Cambridge, which created the IELTS exam and stuff like that, is now saying that multilingualism in the English language classroom is good, and how code switching and translanguaging should be something that English language teachers should accept in their classroom. And I think this is rather groundbreaking and interesting because the linguistic repertoire of the students, whether it's in Tagalog or English or whatever regional language they use, can actually be used to full effect. It's upon the teacher how they will do that, though. Do you allow it when it comes to speaking or participating in the classroom? Do you allow it when it comes to writing? And what I do for my academic paper is I ask my students to write about Philippine popular culture in English. So there are certain words or terms that they use that because you can't really translate everything in English, and it makes them feel more, it also gives them feel that whatever Philippine popular cultural term they're discussing is actually very valuable to them because it's also something that comes from the Philippines. So that's what I was thinking about when it comes to addressing the language barrier. Just allow them, it's better for them to speak up rather than to be met with complete radio silence. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I think this was touched, but I would like to you could expand more on this. What tool or tools may best be used for topics involving oral communication, considering the limited setup of education nowadays. So tools for online for oral communication.
I'm assuming this has to do with how can we communicate orally, both online and offline, siguro, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Kit, do you want to start?
Well,
Because I remember there was a question also like, how can we transmute like offline the gaming part? So maybe you can talk a bit more about that also.
Well, I think because I'm actually the advisor of the UP Debate Society right now. And what they do is they have a lot of online debates, and it's basically the same. I mean, whatever oral speaking engagement that you have that you usually do face to face can still be done online. It's just that I think what happens online is that there should be more collaboration or assistance or scaffolding from the teacher to help the groups. Okay, so because usually the scaffolding or help happens, in the classroom, and then now that you're asking them to do like whatever oral communication task, they may feel like you're leaving them alone. So it's always better to have consultations, group consultations, if you can't do one-on-one consultations when it comes to these oral communication tasks.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe to add as well, for example, like I think I mentioned this in my talk earlier, that like the phone is one platform that I use during the mock interview when my student didn't have a stable internet connection. So I think exploring simple things like that, like what if, the student um can talk via the or via phone calls instead of, maybe Zoom calls. I think as well in Messenger, I haven't tried this, but I'm just thinking, I'm exploring, we can explore the platform together. But I think in the Messenger platform, you can also record your like you can send a voice message. But I think it's just a minute or so, so it's limited. So I'm thinking now, in case you have no if the students have very limited, internet connection, and I think Messenger and Facebook platforms are not as bandwidth heavy, no. I think one way we can explore is actually to ask students to send voice recording, kasi wala tayong magagawa talaga. I mean we are faced with such a huge structural systemic problem, and we always have to make do with what we have as teachers. And I think it's even more difficult for other universities. Now, I've read some of the comments earlier, and like you have 100 students, like that's really a lot. So yeah, I think that's also one way to do it. Like if they cannot really go online on Zoom, then maybe you can have quick speaking activities that they can do via messenger recording, and then you can just listen to their voices and say, oh, you didn't pronounce this word correctly, or maybe you can make your voice a little bit louder, etc., etc. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, because right now I'm experiencing internet connectivity problems. So I might be turning, off my videos from time to time so that I won't, completely be logged out. So even the professors, also experience this
Yes.
difficulties, in internet connection, as well as the challenges of online learning, per se, and as well as all of these, anxieties, related to the pandemic. So we have a question, okay, and this is directed to Professor Uichoko from the Zoom Q&A. So regarding gamification, may we ask if there is a method to use gamification asynchronously? Okay, so this is the reality of today, because now
Okay, asynchronously, I forgot what asynchron. That's when you're not
That's
on.
offline.
I think it's possible. I think what you can do is the same thing that we would do on face to face, you can ask students to do particular games either on their own or as a group. If one of the things that I make sure is in each house, because I call my groups houses, in each house they need to have a chat, what do you call this, a chat group, so that they have whatever platform they want to use, they can actually chat with each other. So if you can have a particular language game that you want them to answer as a group or as individuals, you can. And I know there are so many language games on the internet right now that you can sort of look at whatever level that you want, whether it's English as a foreign language or a second language or academic English. There. Thank you.
okay, yeah. So wait. Now I'm going to look at the questions, okay, from the chat box. So there are a lot of reactions, okay, regarding anxiety and all, and the difficulties of online communication. Yeah, okay. So one is yeah, so we have internet connectivity problems from time to time, and then there are regarding the issue of politeness. Okay, minsan may use na ha, he, ha, ha, for politeness, then to soften the blow of what they're saying, so that it's not serious and all. Okay, so here there is a question, okay, regarding feedback. Okay, so immediate feedback is highly necessary. So, however, the challenge in some schools, including mine, is unlike UP, teachers have a teaching load of to 8 classes and a class size of more than 40 students. While it is ideal to provide feedback and immediate at that, teachers get overwhelmed by an immediate immense output of responses and written outputs. If CHED cannot address that healthy teacher-student ratio, what would be your advice for teachers who are handling so many students? Yeah.
For me, group work is a blessing for both students and teachers. For students, because they have help when it comes to work that they need to do. And then for teachers, your immediate feedback, instead of doing it one at a time, can be for a group. What I would do, I would break it down. And I think last semester I had around 35 students or 38 students in my classroom. So although we wish that it would only be 15 or 20, it does become, it is higher. So that's one of the reasons why I would have group, not just group oral presentations, but sometimes group papers. I do find a way to be able to figure out how each person also is able to give in certain kinds of work, and then so that lessens the workload a lot if you do things by a group.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Yeah, I mean, first of all, of course, there should something should be done about this very unjust situation that we have one teacher for 50 students. I think that's really like unjust. So that's first. But what can we do for now? Well, aside from what Kit suggested, I know that it's impossible to give immediate feedback, but what I also do is I give thematic feedback. So for example, I look at, like, I browse through the submissions again if this is written, and then I try to take note of what are the recurring issues that come up instead of like individually replying to all of their submissions. So for example, there is a discussion forum thread that I do in Google Classroom, and then instead of responding to all of their answers one by one, what I do is I read everything, and then I try to take note of what the salient points that were discussed, and then maybe I post a general feedback on the via Google Classroom, or I address it in our next session before proceeding to the next lesson. So I think that's also maybe a way to make the feedback more efficient, because I do understand it's really difficult right now, and to be honest, I think all of us are struggling with giving feedback. So I think putting them in blocks, like as Kit mentioned, the group thing, and also maybe making it more thematic rather than making it individual could be more efficient and could lessen our burden as teachers as well. Also, peer grading. I think I forgot to mention that it does not only lessen the burden of the teacher, but it also decentralizes the classroom, because again, as I mentioned, for me, English 30, my role really is a facilitator. I do provide some knowledge. I perhaps am like an expert in terms of understanding the language dynamics, but we have to think about our students as also sources of knowledge. No, they themselves know what to do in certain circumstances more than we do. They know their generation better. They also understand this dynamics in a different way. So I think another way to maybe lessen this idea of being the sole source of feedback is to organize peer review. So you give each other feedback, and so what I do is I give them a rubrics, or sometimes if it's more qualitative, they just give comments, and then maybe one person from each group can provide like the general synthesis of the review or the feedback, and then I give a more general version of the feedback for everyone. Or maybe my role is just to answer some contentions that they have, or some confusing aspects of the activity or the lesson, and so I think that lessens also my burden, but it also, more importantly, empowers the students to learn from each other and to give constructive criticism to each other.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion from Irish. what I do when it comes to giving the pitch or the proposal in purposive communication is that I have certain houses that are assigned to be the critiquers. They're the ones who are assigned to give the feedback. If I think they're not giving enough feedback, that's the only time I jump in. But during that time, I usually try to be the moderator, and then the ones who give feedback, the one who talks about the strengths and the weaknesses of a particular group is also another group which was assigned beforehand.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the insight. So now we rethink the role of the professor, okay, and our role, in the online learning could be, facilitators, and also moderator, and to acknowledge also the students, as generator of knowledge and information. Now I'm going to read some of the comments, okay, from the chat. So we have here for our, and this may touch on topics that have been earlier discussed. So for one here, for oral communication class, recorded tasks could be useful and pair them for peer rating after providing the rubrics, okay? And then there is this one. Actually, when I communicate with them through Messenger, I also use a lot of emojis, and I feel that they are encouraged to communicate. It is sort of preparing them for the interaction, okay, in the meet, okay? So here, and then there's one, I also give generalized feedback, okay, and then also peer feedbacking, and then also in peer rating, we also empower the students as well. Okay, so now there is a question here regarding the language use, okay? Would it be good to use English, Filipino, and mother tongue integratively in teaching purposive communication? Okay, so regarding language use, okay?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think Kit already mentioned earlier the idea of code switching and translanguaging, and fostering a more multilingual setup in our classrooms. I do think this is a contentious discussion, no? I think until now on do we really have to force students to speak in straight English when they're in class? Do we penalize them if they don't speak in English, or they code switch, etc., etc.? But the reality is we are navigating a highly multilingual workplace, and we also discussed this in class, that in the real workplace you don't really speak, nobody really speaks in straight English. And I think Kit's lecture presentation on the world English as paradigm also kind of shows us that there in the first place there are different varieties of English. And again, there's so many political dimensions to that, having the unequal Englishes, the whole embeddedness of class, and being able to speak good English, etc., etc. But that's why I think it's important for me as a teacher in English 30 to frame my discussion with a critical lens before providing them the essentials of business communication. So for example, before we talk about how to write an email or how to write a formal proposal, we talk about first the lesson that was provided by Kit earlier on, the framework of world Englishes. Because first, it's important that students understand why do we even use English in the first place. And it's not a neutral subject, because it has to do with our colonial past, but also the realities of globalization and neoliberalization, etc., etc. But then translated on ground, I think the reason it's called purposive communication is that we are teaching our students to understand the context of their communication and not just parrot the lessons that we teach. What I mean by this is students will be able to learn how to speak in English in other ways. But I think what's important is that in our class, we make sure that this learning is always from a more grounded and critical perspective. So for example, we also had a discussion in my class a few weeks ago about credibility in use of English. So I asked them, if a person cannot speak in straight English, or if a person commits grammatical errors in English, does the person lose its credibility? That was the question. And then I found the students' answers quite insightful, because some of them said, yes, of course, you have to be professional, etc. But some students also raised the idea of communicating in a multinational context, meaning you're talking to people from Taiwan, you're talking from people from Japan, from the US, from Israel, from, from Europe, and their Englishes are also not native. And I'm not saying not perfect, but not native. So what does that mean? And this is not to say that we should condone, grammar errors, and we should be okay with people not knowing how to communicate perfectly. But I think this rather frames both the teacher and the students into thinking that I speak in English in a particular way, but I have to understand that more than memorizing the grammar rules, there are also social cultural aspects of communicating that I have to know. So for my students, they don't think that they lose credibility if they commit quote unquote grammatical errors. Kasi baka the grammatical errors are actually a feature of Filipino English, which is very different from American English or British English. So for me personally, if there is a grammatical error, of course I correct that. But I don't make it like the end all be all of my class. In fact, I remember when we had the face to face, I had the final project was for them to present a business proposal to their chosen audience. So one of the groups actually wanted to present a project in a community. So barangay, they're a group of engineering students who wanted to create a solar something. I'm not familiar with that, but the solar equipment. But it had to be communicated to the community, like a chosen community, but it's all hypothetical. And they were speaking in straight English in the beginning. And then they asked me, but ma'am, the reality is when we go to the communities, they don't actually need us to speak in English because they will get confused. So I said, then that's for you to think about. What do you think is the perfect, or what is the more appropriate and context specific way of communicating? So I think if we reframe our lessons and maybe go outside of the traditional English teaching model that we have, I'm sure Kit agrees with me, then we can make the lesson also, di ba, hindi siya, it's really critical as well. It's not just people teaching, teachers teaching the house, but really making the students also think of the whys. Because communication is also dynamic. So many things are changing now. Even the relationships in the workplace also change. So ayun siguro. I think for me, I'm not really going to prescribe that, no, it's okay, you should use Taglish. Of course, it's still up to you teachers, what you feel most comfortable. But I do want us to think about, all of these other factors na. What do we really want our students to learn at the end of the day? And what kinds of skills do we want them to be able to adopt and use when they do leave the classroom and, face the real world, quote unquote?
Yeah, for me, it's very interesting because the text that I used in the conference prior to this one is from Lyd King and from Cambridge. So that I mean, if we're going to look at the gatekeepers of language, okay, Cambridge is one of those gatekeepers because they create the IELTS exam and stuff like that. So if I may, which is why it's interesting that they do talk about multilingualism. And what King says is that multilingualism, if you allow it in your English language classroom, respects mother tongue heritage. It prepares young people for a globalized world with English as a lingua franca. So there's still a globalized world, but English is the lingua franca. So you do allow that there might be some words or phrases from those different worlds coming in. And multilingualism is actually the normal human condition. If we insist on monolingualism, you're actually insisting on creating everything for Americans, and not just Americans, but white Americans or Caucasians. Multilingualism is also the fruit of the new economy, and it is a characteristic of a place. One other thing that I wanted to say is that multilingualism in other countries in Europe is usually positive. It's considered aspirational because it shows vitality. Unfortunately, in the Philippines, it can create, teachers in particular, can create feelings of loss and uncertainty fueled by the simplistic promises of nationalism and extremism of all kinds. So if we insist too much on monolingual English language teaching, you don't know it, but you're actually insisting on colonial language teaching practices, which privileges the Americans rather than privileging our students who are Filipinos.
Okay. Okay. I have a question here on chat. Okay. What do you think about using Taglish and conversational language this time in writing papers? What
Right.
would be your policies on that? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So for the past few years, when it comes to a different class, which is English 13, okay, I've allowed code switching because I asked them to write about Philippine cultural pop culture. So if you're going to talk about certain what you call this telenovelas that are in Tagalog, I mean, they're going to retain the Tagalog titles, you know, and then there are certain things that are very hard to translate and that you don't want them to translate. So even in our Philippine English dictionaries, there are a lot of lexical items which are basically Tagalog. I mean, do you really want them to change halo-halo to mix-mix, right? No. So today, for my classes this semester, I'm asking them to write about gender and Philippine election season. And I said that they should look at placards and memes and stuff like that. I don't expect them to translate everything in English. Like there was a placard recently that I saw na hindi kami sibuyas, diba? I mean, how are you gonna ask them to translate to that to we're not onions? So I think if you make it in such a way where it seems natural for them, you know, that they don't have to do it monolingually, then they can. It really depends, I think, on the teacher in the end, though. So I like Irish said, I wouldn't prescribe it, but it's really up to you.
It's a bit of a it's a challenging question because personally I haven't really tried allowing Taglish in my class. I mean, what I mean by Taglish is like actually explaining things in Tagalog in a paragraph, for example. I think that's but I do think that it should happen. I mean, I haven't done it, but if we want to really understand and maybe be colonial in the ways we do our we teach in our classroom, I think there should be a way to do it. I just personally I do not have the system yet in place in my classroom, but maybe, and I've been seeing the conversation on chat via oral communication, like, is it okay to use Taglish? I mean, definitely I think it should be okay. But what I forgot to mention this is that I do acknowledge that the reality of the academic space and the reality of the workplace, they haven't there are very few intersections, and we don't always share the same ideologies about these things. What do I mean by this? For example, somebody said here that, and I agree totally, that Filipinos are very harsh when it comes to other Filipinos committing grammatical errors in English. And I do fear that in the workplace, this is also true, no? Like, I do tell my students that, well, we try to be very progressive and critical in our classroom, but I cannot promise you that when you do actually go to an interview, your interviewers would be as open-minded as I am, and they would agree to the whole multilingualism framework. And I think in IELTS, for example, and in TOEFL, they're not gonna say, it's okay that she committed many grammatical errors. She will get a high grade. And of course, that could cost you your employment, and which also is counterproductive to the goal of this course, because we also do want to help our students get the jobs that they need in the marketplace, as much as we don't want to subscribe to the idea. So I think for me, the compromise is, if I do allow students to speak in Taglish in class, or maybe they will say, Ma'am, is it okay if I speak in Tagalog because I cannot explain it in English right now? Of course, I allow that. But what I do is I translate their answers in English. So it's a way of modeling it to them, so that maybe when they do try to answer next time, they have a framework like, okay, maybe that's how I can explain it in English. Because most of the time, I think the students can learn this anyway, but it's the thinking time, because if you're not really used to speaking in English, of course you have to take time to translate it in your mind, and then there's language one interference, etc., etc. There's mother tongue, especially if you have 3 languages or 4 languages that you're using. So that's one way I think that I do that I make the compromise. That of course I agree that we shouldn't penalize students, but at the same time, we have to also acknowledge the reality that they still have to speak good English, because what if the interviewer thinks that even if they're qualified, diba, just because they cannot answer in straight English, then they don't get the job. So that's it for me. I think it's really creating a safe space also in your classroom to say, okay, it's okay if you cannot speak in English right now, but I hope that next time we still try to speak in English, and then we try to make sure to not be critical of each other if you make grammar mistakes. So siguro that's a way for me also to try to compromise and try to balance this criticality, but also this reality of, well, they have to learn the skills at the end of the day, because we're not the employers, right? So yeah, I think that could be for me, that could be a way to negotiate.
Okay, I have a few to add to what Irish said. When Irish was saying that you could code switch, etc., and for her it's perfectly okay. Actually, I feel bad because I think I only allowed it really this year. I didn't allow it in the years past, and I feel like I was censoring my students, because now that I allowed it, I especially in my literature class, I have students who are able to apply very, like talk about Bakhtin and Marxism in Tagalog, okay, or in Taglish when they're discussing a short story. So there you can see they understand the content really well, and you can see that they're really good at expressing themselves in Taglish. So for me, what's important is to be able to allow them to express themselves, but in the end, you also have to scaffold it, like what Irish was saying, that eventually at the end of the course, you want them to be able to do both. You want them to use Filipino or whatever language they're using to help them with the knowledge that they're trying to construct or the knowledge that they're understanding. But in the end, your output can be in English. Now, like I said earlier, okay, for me, for the past few years, I've had some Taglish in my formal papers, because what I did was I asked them to write about popular culture, right? Which is so hard if you're not going to use Taglish. In the 1980s, Gloria Anzaldúa wrote a critical paper called Las Mestizas and Borderlanders. And you'll be surprised because almost half of it is in Spanish and half of it is in English. And it's considered one of the best critical reading, academic articles out there. If you look at the Mexican American digests right now or journals in 2021, there are essays that are trans-languaging. Okay, so which sort of like which 1/3 is in Spanish and 2/3 is in English. Okay, but the question is, who is your audience? And for them, their audience is fellow Hispanic communities in America. Okay, so the question, I think, is very important when you think of what your objective is. Especially, we're talking about purposive communication. In the end, if you're thinking of your students getting into call centers is a very important thing that they have to learn in this class, then they have to be able to speak straight English for a very long time. And that, how you get there is up to the teacher and how you scaffold it, but that's your output. But in the end, if, for example, you want them to be able to be if at the end you want them to be very good communicators, whether it's in Philippine English or world English, then that's also something that you have to think about. So I think these are issues and concerns that individual teachers have to think about. What are your objectives for your class? If your objectives for your class is for them to get a job or to pass the IELTS exam or TOEFL or whatever exam, and you need them to speak in straight English, the question is, how do you get them there? I don't think we should insist in a monolingual design for the whole semester. But if in the end that's what you need for your final output, then that's perfectly okay also.
Okay, yeah. I have here a question. How can we emphasize the importance of conveying messages responsibly? And we're not just only talking about, what happens in the classroom, but also in everyday life, especially in the context of what's happening politically, which is the national elections right now.
I'm sorry, what's the question again?
Okay, how can we emphasize the importance of conveying messages outside, especially in the context of the very highly political reality that we are having right now? Mm-hmm.
I don't really Irish, do you understand? I don't really understand the question so much.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I'm assuming the question has to do with what kinds of communication what considerations should we have in communication?
I'll repeat the question. How do we emphasize the importance of conveying messages responsibly? So meaning the responsible, conveying of messages. Not only inside the classroom, but also outside.
Okay, that's okay. I think I sort of get it.
Yeah.
One of my lessons for purposive communication, which is not, I think, in the textbook, but which I have in my in my modules when I teach it in UP, is the entire when it comes to all of the platforms that we speak in, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or email or textbook, text messaging and stuff like that. I discuss the right way to actually present yourselves, especially if you're going to be interviewed or if you're going to, if you apply for a job, a lot of the HR people go and look at your Facebook account, okay? And they actually, that's why for me, I tell my students, you shouldn't have yourself in a bikini in your Facebook profile, because you might actually, if you have a very conservative employer and sees that, then that might affect your chances. So that, for me, that's the way I deal with that, like how to be more professional. But of course you can't, these are just things that I advise like a mom, not really stringently mandate.
For me, though, I understood the question a bit differently. So I was thinking of maybe another way to answer it. I was thinking more of maybe how they should communicate their ideas and like political position online, not just in the classroom. So I was thinking perhaps in the context of, and I think this is a good, it's good to take advantage of this issue, no? Because purposive communication is at its very core context-specific communication. So I always emphasize to the students that most of the time, or maybe all the time, what is more important is how you communicate rather than not more important, but it is important. It's equally important to think about how you're going to communicate something versus what you are going to communicate. Because purposive communication is precisely that. You have a purpose for communicating a particular idea, or perhaps, like, for example, when you want to apply for a job, so the purpose is to get a job. If you want to send a business proposal, etc., that's also a purpose. So, oh, somebody said it was about political correctness, gender, and cultural sensitivities. Okay, great. Yeah. So related to that is what I mean is that you always have to think about context. The first thing is, it's the same when you send an email to someone. Try to listen to yourself, read the email, and think, can you say this face to face? Like, if this is how you construct your email, are you comfortable informing, like sending this message to someone in person? Like, if you can say it to their face, then great, then perhaps you are being sensitive and polite. But if you cannot, if it's an email that you yourself don't want to receive, then you have to change something there. And again, this goes back to why Gen Z always uses emojis, because for them, they would feel anxious getting, straight like messages, although again, that has a different implication. So second, of course, you have to be sensitive. We are now, like, we have been celebrated as a country that supposedly has a high gender equality index, and yet we still hear so many misogynistic and sexist remarks online. And precisely it's because people don't think about the other person behind the screen. Like, again, will you be able to comfortably make a rather rude and sexist, misogynistic remark if you're face to face with the person? You won't, right? But so I think it's important to teach these to the students as well, that all of these things have to do with what you call this, you have to deliberate, and you have to think twice, like maybe even thrice, like literally have to read and reread. And I think this is also a practical skill. Proofreading is an essential skill to making sure that we are being politically correct and we are being gender sensitive, because sometimes people don't really mean to be rude, but again, because when you communicate, you think and then you say that, and then you don't think twice about what you're saying. But then if you sit down and reread your ideas, and you realize, oh, I think perhaps this person, if they read this, it would be more it would be offensive, so I have to rewrite that. So see, it's a very practical skill, proofreading, but it has this social cultural implications as well. And then secondly, for me, the classroom management practice on gender sensitivity that I wish I was able to discuss in my presentation is respecting people's pronouns. I don't know where people are at in that discussion, but for me, it has to do with, like, just really being respectful. If the person feels more comfortable being referred to using this pronoun, then I respect that totally. So what I tell them is that when they enter the Zoom class or maybe Google Meet, they can edit their name. So for example, for me, I'm Miss Irish Joy de Ocampo. I just write Irish, and then in parentheses I put she, her, if those are my pronouns, or they, them. And if that's what they prefer, then so be it. For me, at least that's what I believe in. Secondly is also maybe ask just simple things like asking them what name they want to be called. Like for me in face-to-face, I always ask my students to write their nickname or what name they want me to call them, because again, it also gives them agency and lessens this whole power dynamics. I get to decide, like, oh, I want to call you this or that. So for me, that's one. Yeah, I think those are the more general insights and ideas that I have related to that. I hope I answered or responded to the question correctly or appropriately.
I agree with Irish also. I think the last slide that I didn't really get to discuss was actually about that. So just fairly quickly, just to show you. um, race and ethnicity, do not use racial epithets. I think that's so basic, but it's so funny because our students don't know that. They think it's cool to actually be racist. For some students, they use nigger or inchik, bombay or indio, and that's basically wrong. So sometimes I really have to explain the history behind these particular terms. Um, when it comes to gender stereotypes, let's not agree that we should use gender stereotypes, and the masculine he as a generic term for both genders should be changed to the third person instead. Social class, let's not use loaded words such as konyo, squatting, or jologs. Age also, discourage the use of ulyanin, or even there's also ageism against young people, a lot of ageism against young people in Philippine society. So we don't want to have ageism. We shouldn't use autistic to refer, or retarded to mean stupid or idiotic. So these are things that are actually generally used in conversation in, I think, for a lot of Filipinos. And when you tell them that this is wrong, they'll actually get a bit surprised because they don't know that what they've been doing is offensive and is basically wrong. And if you're going to join the professions, you should not be using this term. So I think that's basically what I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I think that is what the question is all about. Responsible communication. Especially that, we're living in these times, and particularly in this very volatile political context as well. Misogyny in language, among other things. Last is there are a lot of questions regarding this in the chat box. What are your recommended learning materials, both online and also perhaps textbooks and other learning resources?
For me, of course, there's my textbook, Communication for Society, Purposive Communication. But when it comes to, any particular paper that I want my students to take up, or anything that's connected to research, I always direct them to the online OWL, Online Writing Laboratory at Purdue University. They started doing a lot of materials from the beginning, I think, when it came to the internet, and they've gradually added so many materials there. So I think that's an excellent, if you're going to look at like the more traditional ways of teaching the papers and English and stuff like that. But I think you would be very much helped by all of the resources that Irish said, and all of the, if you've been looking at the chat, all of the resources on the chat, you have fellow teachers sharing also the resources that have helped them a lot. So I think this is a wonderful resource for what else can be done in the online writing classroom, because it really is hard. I think everybody is having a hard time when it comes to adjusting to online learning.
Yes. Yeah, I think the chat box, I'm actually reading and taking notes as well, because I'm learning a lot from the participants as well, because some of these things I don't know. So thank you so much for really engaging with each other as well. But yeah, my primary text is the one that I mentioned, which is Guffey and Lowy's English Business. So that's the one that I often use in my, I'm looking at my phone now just to check which titles I have. So I have the PDF copy for my students, and then I also use like journal articles for the more critical text, like such as Essentials of Business Communication. I'll just write this down. So that's by Guffey and Lowy. Again, I just a disclaimer that this is an internet, like a non-Filipino context. So you might have to contextualize from time to time some of the examples that were given. And then I also have some critical texts such as Power and Politeness. I have those readings. Maybe I can type them down just so maybe if you, because I think you can look for this online. So these are the more critical texts that I use for, discussing the dynamics in the workplace. And then I also have, yeah, David Crystal's, although this is more, you use that kit, I think. No, I'm not sure. But this is English as a global language. So those are like actual texts that I use in my class. I also have like some on gender, but yeah, I think if you have your themes laid out, then it's also easier for you to look for these sources.
Okay.
Grace and Kit, I have a question in the Q&A that I think it's crucial perhaps for us to answer, that I
Okay.
think Kit also would like to respond to this. So again, it has to go, it's going back to the idea of using English, and being more translanguage, or allowing code switching. So somebody said here, will allowing Taglish in English classes water down the teaching of English language? So, and then a related comment is, teachers, especially English teachers, spoke in straight English and required students to do the same. I must say, students learn to speak correct English because of the teacher's modeling. I noticed that some UP graduates of recent years no longer speak good English, even some teachers in grad school. Should this not be a matter of concern for the university? Because I feel like maybe we can like just respond to this and perhaps like maybe synthesize or close the
Okay.
discussion on, because I feel
Sure.
like it's such a
Yeah.
controversial
Yeah, I think so
topic,
too.
no?
Yeah. Okay, so what are your thoughts on that, Professor De Ocampo?
I know
It's
I read it,
interesting.
but
Yeah, I
um,
mean,
Kit, maybe you want to
regarding
respond
that,
first,
uh,
because you
yeah.
also you're doing your master, you also did your masters and your graduate studies in UP, so I think it would also be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Could you do it one at a time? What's the
No,
first?
it's in the QA. It's just about this, the question on if we
Yeah, the
allow
question's kind of low.
Taglish in, yeah, if we allow students to speak Taglish in the classroom, wouldn't that water down, learning English? And then another comment was like in UP, teachers used to teach in straight English, and that's why students are great in English. And then now, it was noticed that the students no longer teach English same way, or like students no longer speak good English. So like perhaps I think it would be important to also address that, because I feel like it's a bit of a contentious issue for our participants.
Okay. I'll try. Okay. For the first one, I am the kind of teacher that when it comes to my student evaluation of the teacher, I think like, except maybe for the last year, I'm considered very intimidating because I speak in straight English the whole class. And that's because English is my first language. Okay. Um, what I do now is I sometimes code switch in order to make jokes with my students. Okay. Because they're more participative, they're more open, they feel like they can express themselves more if the teacher can actually crack a joke or two in Taglish, or maybe crack a joke or two in general. uh, I am, like I said, I'm finishing my PhD right now, so I was able to be under a lot of teachers from the old school, like Prichi Lagasto and all that, and they speak wonderful and excellent English. I wouldn't generalize though that their generation is better at English than this generation. I think it's just that this generation, or the I don't even know if I could be considered a young faculty member. I'm 44. Okay, so um, uh, the younger generation, I wouldn't say that they're much worse off when it comes to their English language. I don't know. I can't. I don't know where for me that's a strange generalization. I don't know if that's actually true, but if it is, I wouldn't say it's because they've been taught using code switching. No, they've actually, it hasn't changed. If you think about it, UP is one of the more old-fashioned schools when it comes to translanguaging and multilingualism. Ateneo is actually more forward-thinking when it comes to this because they've been talking about multilingualism and translanguaging, and they actually set up a conference about it just recently. So UP is actually one of those old institutions. It might be one of the last institutions that will hold on to teachers saying, no, we will have a monolingual classroom. So I don't know if that's colonial or just because it's old fashioned or traditional, but you might get the idea that we are the norm. No, what Irish and I are saying is actually pretty revolutionary and pretty different from what a lot of the faculty members in UP believe. And a lot of UP faculty members still really do teach in a monolingual atmosphere and environment.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just to add a little bit, I'll borrow the concept that Miss Professor Candice said, that there's the idea of the affective filter, and I think somebody also pointed that out in the chat, that if this very monolingual policy in your class only serves to silence students and we don't get to hear their thoughts because they're scared that they might commit a mistake in English, then I think it's very counterproductive to our role as teachers and to our role, as to our role in ensuring a critical space for our students to think. So I think that's first. So, because again, this language issue is not neutral, and we know that there are so many social cultural baggages that English carries with it, right? But then secondly, I agree with Kit. I don't think that students who don't speak good English, I don't think that's because of code switching or there's so many language theories that talks about that. But I think the more important conversation should be why this insistence on perfect English, because that doesn't exist. There are so many studies already that have been done on decentralizing Native American English, and I think perhaps that's what most of us grew up believing to be the correct English. But language, as much as culture, constantly changes what is considered, right? There's so many patriarchal and sexist values in the past that we thought were normal, but now we know they're not, right? Like female students were not allowed to go to school, but that has changed. And so language also comes with that. So I think what I really want to emphasize here is, of course, we want our students to be fluent. We want them to speak their minds. We want them to assert their rights. But I think we have to reframe in thinking about the medium, like why are we putting it in such a pedestal, and if we can maybe find a way to make our classroom negotiate all of these issues, then I think that would be a more well-rounded and critical communicator, rather than just someone who has perfect grammar but cannot think critically, right? So I think for me it's that we cannot really discuss all the language policies and theories about bilingual and multilingual, but yeah, I think that's what Kit and I want to highlight here, that as we teach these rules to the students, we also want to foster criticality among them, because at the end of the day, that's what they need to survive in real life. They need to know and question things and norms, because that's how to be a human being. We're not robots.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you, Professor De Ocampo and Professor Ochoco. So before we go to the synthesis and the awarding of certificates and the closing remarks and the picture taking, some announcements. So the evaluation form, I think, is posted in the chat, so you may answer. So now for the synthesis. So I'll talk about briefly the presentations that we have, as well as some of the points taken up in the Q&A. So the first speaker was Professor Ochoco, and regarding the gamification, so it's titled Play the Game. So Professor Ochoco discussed how to gamify, okay, the teaching in the online setup. So she discussed how to use apps or websites like Duolingo and Jeopardy labs and games as outcome oriented, and to improve games grades by participation. And also there is a discussion on the world Englishes, so meaning that you have to understand, okay, the context, okay, and how different speakers from around the world would have terms or would use the English language, okay, in different ways. So this is one of the ways to teach amidst the many challenges that we have during the pandemic. So our second speaker, Professor De Ocampo, her title is Keeping It Pro-Fresh, and it's regarding teaching English 30, which is in UP, which is English for the professions. So how do we effectively communicate in English, and how do we have that critical communication? So there's also this discussion on how to facilitate in class, and now we see that the teacher is the facilitator of the discussion, and how to also encourage participation among the students. So she discussed the importance of feedback and the importance of peer consultation and collaboration. So also discuss maximizing platforms such as the breakout sessions and the chat box, multimodal materials such as emojis, audiovisual tools, Mentimeters, and Canva, and also outsourced learning materials such as inviting guest speakers, access to podcasts and YouTube instructional materials. And regarding the Q&A, a lot of the discussion has involved like how to teach these, more details regarding that, learning materials, as well as how to think about English usage critically, especially with this current situation, and also regarding language use and the practical application, how this is enacted, especially since we know, or it has been talked about that English, as like many people speak English in different wonderful sessions regarding this. So now we go on. Now I call Professor Nancy Kimwell Gabriel, Director of the UP General Education Center, for the awarding of certificates to our speakers, and as well as giving the closing remarks. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Professor
Yes,
Nancy
I'm
Gabriel.
here,
Yeah.
Dr. Gray.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So at this point, we would like to express our appreciation to Assistant Professor Marikit Tara Ochoco and Miss Irish De Ocampo. And okay, let me read this certificate of appreciation. The General Education Center, Office of the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, University of the Philippines, Diliman, and Commission on Higher Ed award this certificate of appreciation to Marikit Tara A. Ochoco for sharing her expertise as resource speaker in the Teach Talk, How to Teach and Manage Your Gen Z Class Purposive Communication Edition under LINANGAN, the GE Faculty Development Extension Program, held on the 21st day of March 2022 via Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook. Signed by yours truly and Dr. Maria Teresa Tipayongayong. Can we have the video of Professor Ochoco yan? So, sige. Prof. Marikit, kunan ka muna namin ng larawan. So, smile beside your certificate. Thank you very much, Ma'am Marikit. and yan. See, may we have the video of Ma'am Irish beside her certificate yan. General Education Center, Office of the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, UP Diliman, and Commission on Higher Education awarded Certificate of Appreciation to Ms. Irish Joy G. De Ocampo for sharing her expertise as resource speaker in the Teach Talk How to Teach and Manage Your Gen Z class, Purposive Communication edition under LINANGAN, the GE Faculty Development Extension Program held on the 21st day of March 2022 via Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook. Signed by yours truly and Dr. Maria Teresa T. Payongayong, our Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Thank you very much, Miss Irish. Let me have your picture taken. Smile. All right. Okay. Thank you very much to our speakers and okay, of course, to our moderator, Dr. Mary Grace R. Concepcion. Let us have the video of Doc Grace beside her certificate. The General Education Center, Office of the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, UP Diliman, and Commission on Higher Education award this Certificate of Appreciation to Mary Grace R. Concepcion as moderator in the Teach Talk, How to Teach and Manage Your Gen Z class under the LINANGAN GE Faculty Development Extension Program held on the 21st day of March 2022 via Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook. Signed by yours truly and Dr. Maria Teresa T. Payongayong, our Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Thank you, Dr. Grace, Associate Professor Marikit Oichoco, and Miss Irish De Ocampo for helping the General Education Center in making this edition possible. And thank you very much to our participants for attending this webinar. I hope this conversation in purposive communication will help you in your teaching of English and in everyday needs, especially in mentoring our students in research and writing. Personally, this is a very reassuring and enhancing session for me. I have many personal takeaways from this session. I love that this session started with the principle that all Englishes are equal, the discussion on multilingualism and translanguaging, and is, I think, very relevant at this point in time. It reminded me to always be clear, simple, and promote understanding and good relationship with my students, to be responsible in my speech, to be politically correct, and to be cultural and gender sensitive too. No, in short, I have to be mindful of the context always, and to be critical also in reading and in writing. Yan. So ang dami ko pong natutunan. I'm not an English language professor, but nakakatulong po ito. I also do code switching. I start in Filipino, ended up in English. Nahahawa din po tayo sa ating Gen Z students. Yan yung aking isang napansin. So kung gumagamit sila ng emoticon, gumagamit na rin ako ng emoticon. Hindi ko alam. Kung naglalagay sila ng hehehe at hahaha sa dulo ng kanilang pangusap, ganon din po ako. No? At naghahabol din ako sa aking technological knowledge to better my communication with them. So, nakakita nga po ako ng isang comment dyan, ano, nag-attend siya ng isang seminar, and the title of the seminar is Purposive Communication, and it is not necessarily in perfect English or straight English, but depende sa purpose, depende sa layunin. Ang importante siguro na iintindihan ng ating kausap tayo at relevant tayo para sa kanila. No, yan din siguro yung magpapaliwanag, yung relevance and yung assertion ng Filipino sa vis-a-vis English language. Kaya nagkakaroon ng code switching. So more and more yung mga kausap natin, students natin, nakikita din nila na kung ano yung relevant para sa kanila at kung paano din nila mas mahusay na mai-communicate ang kanilang ideya at insight sa isa't isa. So nagpapasalamat po kami ng marami sa mga professors na katulong natin ngayon sa paglilinaw ng mga prinsipyo at mga napag-aralan at isinasagawa na nilang pamamaraan sa pagtuturo ng English 30 at Purposive Communication. Yan. And thank you to the organizers of the webinar for keeping the light burning. Naisip ko nga tuloy kanina, pati yung idioms natin in English. So I think may epekto din sa atin yung pagko-contextualize so that we can also use idiom in Filipino, di ba? Tapos mahirap i-translate ang mga idiom natin in English because it is very cultural, it's very contextual. And may pinagdaanang kasaysayan at sariling realidad. Ayan. Kaya na-appreciate ko yung multilingualism discussion portion kanina. Hindi lang Tagalog, no? Pati Bisaya, Tausug, Ilocano, lahat ng wikang sinasalita ng mga ethnic groups sa Pilipinas. Yan. Ang lahat po ng recordings ay ina-upload sa GEC website. So pakilagay uli natin ang link ng GEC website. Ito pong recording ng Purposive Communication ay kaagad-agad nang i-upload natin as soon as possible kapag naihanda na yung write-up for this. And hingin din po natin ang consent ng ating mga tagapagsalita kung maaaring i-share, ipadala ang kanilang PowerPoint dahil may mga nanghihingi po tayong teachers dito sa ating webinar. At pinasasalamatan ko po ang ating participants. Napakaraming insights sa chat box. Sila rin po, napakarami nilang ideya at pananaw na iniambag, pati mga learning resources at kung saan ito matatagpuan. Ang susunod po nating webinar ay tungkol naman sa wika, panitikan at kulturang Pilipino, Phil 40. Ito po ay sa susunod na buwan, April 22, it's a Friday. Magkita-kita po tayong ulit at para mas maging mayaman ang ating talakayan tungkol sa wika at kultura. Yan yung mga insights dito and principles and contentious issues. I'm sure ma-extend doon sa discussion ng wika at kultura sa Phil 40. Salamat po ng marami.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, all of the materials, please be posted. This would be announced in the GEC website. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, pictures, organizers, and speakers. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sige.
Yun pala yung nakita kong kanina sa chat. yung sinasabi kong nabasa ko ay sino ko. Ang dami kasi hindi ko na ba. Ang dami ko na. Pero ang haba ng kanyang sinabi. Kaya okay din. Sige, picture na tayo.
Picture? Okay.
Okay po.
Sige.
1, 2, 3. Wait lang. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Thank you po.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Ma'am Kit. Ma'am
Thank
Irish.
you.